104 years ago, something happened in the United States that the United States spent the next 7 decades pretending never happened at all, not forgotten the way most history is forgotten, slowly and passively, through the disinterest of generations. This was deliberate. Documents were removed. Archives went missing. Newspaper pages were physically torn out before the editions were bound and preserved. An entire city's worth of evidence vanished, and the people who had watched their world burn in a single night were told, in every way, a society can communicate such a thing without saying the words directly, to stay quiet. Follow this story all the way through, because every piece of what happened in Tulsa in the spring of 1921 only makes full sense when you hold it all together. Like and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. The weight of what was destroyed can only be felt if you first understand what was actually there. And that means going back before the massacre itself, back to the moment when a community began building something so remarkable that it would eventually make powerful people deeply afraid. In the years following the Civil War, a particular kind of restless ambition swept through the newly admitted state of Oklahoma. The territory had been carved out of what the American government had previously designated as Indian land, a region that federal officials had long insisted was too barren to be worth competing over. That assessment turned out to be spectacularly wrong. Oil was discovered beneath the Oklahoma soil in quantities that stunned even the most optimistic prospectors, and almost overnight a landscape of red clay and prairie grass was transformed into one of the most economically charged places on the continent. Within 2 decades, booming industrial centers with paved streets, steel-framed buildings, and all the speculative ambition that comes with sudden wealth. Tulsa was at the center of all of it, a city that had grown from a trading settlement of barely 1,000 residents to a sprawling place of over 70,000, calling itself, without exaggeration, the oil capital of the world. Among those drawn to Oklahoma were thousands of Black Americans who had made their way there for precisely the same reasons as everyone else, in search of land, livelihood, and a degree of personal autonomy that the Deep South had never offered them. Many settled in the northern section of Tulsa, in a neighborhood that would come to be known as the Greenwood district. What they built there over the course of roughly 15 years is, by any serious historical measure, one of the most extraordinary achievements in the entire history of Black America. The story of Greenwood begins with a single man. In 1906, a former school principal from Arkansas named O.W. Gurley purchased 40 acres of land in northern Tulsa and began selling parcels exclusively to Black buyers. He had been educated at Atlanta University, and he arrived in Oklahoma with a vision that was both idealistic and entirely practical: to create a community owned and controlled by Black people, built on the conviction that economic independence was the only real and durable basis for human dignity. He constructed a rooming house on the main thoroughfare, named the street Greenwood Avenue, opened a grocery store, and within a few years the street had transformed around him. What Greenwood became within the span of a single generation is staggering. By 1921, the district contained 191 documented businesses, grocery stores and clothing shops, jewelry stores and furriers, billiard halls and photography studios, 2 newspapers, 2 movie theaters, a public library, a hospital, and 2 schools whose standards were considered among the finest in the state. There were law firms, dental practices, and medical offices staffed by Black professionals who had earned their degrees from universities across the country and deliberately brought those credentials home to their own community. There were hotels of such quality that their dining rooms and ballrooms served as the premier social destinations for Black Tulsa, and churches whose buildings were architectural statements of permanence and civic pride made visible in stone and stained glass. The economic detail that perhaps best captures what Greenwood was comes from historians who studied how money moved through the district. $1 circulated an average of 36 times before it left the neighborhood's economy. Money in Greenwood did not pass through on its way to white-owned banks and suppliers elsewhere. It stayed, it turned over, it compounded. A dress purchased at a Greenwood boutique meant wages paid to a Greenwood seamstress, who spent those wages at a Greenwood restaurant, whose owner deposited the earnings with a Greenwood accountant, who went home to a house on a Greenwood street. The district was structurally self-sustaining in a way that very few communities anywhere in America, of any race, ever managed to achieve. Among the individuals who made Greenwood what it was, one figure stands apart for the sheer scale of what he built. J.B. Stratford had graduated from Indiana University with a law degree and arrived in Greenwood with the same vision that had driven Gurley: buy land, develop it, keep the profits within the community. By 1921, he had become one of the wealthiest Black men in America. His crowning achievement was the Stratford Hotel, a 54-room establishment with private baths, a formal dining room, and a ballroom considered by many observers to be the finest hotel in Tulsa, not the finest Black hotel, the finest hotel in the city, period. white travelers requiring accommodations of a certain standard sometimes quietly inquired whether they might be permitted to stay at the Stratford. Gurley himself, who had started it all, owned over 100 properties in Greenwood by 1921, with a net worth estimated at somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million, a figure almost incomprehensible for a black man operating under fully enforced Jim Crow law. Then there was the Williams family. John and Lula Williams had arrived in Tulsa with almost nothing and built a commercial empire that included an automobile garage, a confectionery with a 12-foot soda fountain, and a 3-story commercial building whose upper floors housed the practices of doctors, dentists, and lawyers. Their most celebrated achievement was the Dreamland Theater, a 750-seat cinema on Greenwood Avenue, where Tulsa's black community gathered on evenings and weekends to simply exist together in a space that was entirely and unapologetically their own. Booker T. Washington, the most prominent black educator in America at the turn of the century, visited Tulsa and saw what was happening in the Greenwood district with his own eyes. His description became the name that history would eventually use. He called it Negro Wall Street, a phrase that refined itself over time into the form the world now recognizes, Black Wall Street. The comparison was not flattery, but a precise observation. The level of capital concentration within those 35 square blocks rivaled anything happening in the white financial district of the same city, and in many respects it was more impressive because it had been built from nothing by people excluded from every formal mechanism of capital accumulation that white Americans took for granted. By the early 1920s, Greenwood's population had reached approximately 10,000 people. Its residents worked in white Tulsa as servants, laborers, and domestic workers during the day, then returned each evening to a world that belonged entirely to them, a world that ran by their own rules, reflected their own values, and answered to their own leadership. There is a painful irony embedded in that daily movement, and the people of Greenwood were entirely aware of it. They were not wealthy in spite of segregation. They were wealthy in the space that segregation had accidentally created because the forced isolation of Jim Crow had made internal economic solidarity not merely a preference, but a practical necessity. And that necessity, sustained over 15 years of disciplined collective effort, had produced something extraordinary. Black Wall Street was not a miracle. It was the product of vision, discipline, and shared commitment, the work of people who had looked at a country that refused to include them and decided, together, to build something it could not take away. They were wrong about that last part. What was happening in Greenwood did not exist in isolation from the country surrounding it, and placing it accurately in its historical moment requires pulling back from Tulsa, because the America of the early 1920s was a nation under enormous pressure, and the most dangerous dimension of that pressure was racial. The First World War had ended in November of 1918, and in the months that followed, hundreds of thousands of black American soldiers came home from Europe. They had fought under the American flag in the trenches of France and Belgium, served with genuine physical courage, and many of them had experienced, for the first time, a European society in which their humanity was recognized regardless of race. When they returned to the United States, they carried with them an expectation that was entirely reasonable and entirely incompatible with the racial hierarchy that American society was still enforcing with lethal commitment. They had survived a world war. That expectation was met with organized, murderous violence. In the summer and fall of 1919, white mobs attacked black communities across the American Midwest and South with a ferocity that shocked even observers accustomed to the routine brutality of American racial life. The period became known as the Red Summer, and across at least 26 cities from Washington, D.C. to Chicago to Omaha to Houston, white crowds attacked black neighborhoods, pulled black men from streetcars, and set fire to entire residential blocks. Black communities that were attacked did not always passively absorb the violence, and in several cities residents fought back, a resistance that was used in many cases as justification for intensified repression in the aftermath. The Ku Klux Klan was undergoing a dramatic national resurgence during this same period. By the end of 1921, credible estimates placed Klan membership in Tulsa alone at around 3,200, in a city of 72,000. It had embedded itself in the police department, the courts, and the city's political structure, held public rallies covered without criticism by the local press, and viewed the prosperity of Greenwood not as a success story but as an intolerable affront to the racial hierarchy it existed to maintain. Oklahoma itself had its own specific history of racial terror. In the years between statehood in 1907 and the spring of 1921, mobs in the state had lynched 33 black men and women. One of those killings had occurred in Tulsa itself less than a year before the massacre. Roy Belton was a white criminal being held in the Tulsa County Jail when a mob assembled and demanded he be released to them. The sheriff stepped aside. The mob drove Belton to the edge of the city and hanged him from a telephone pole. The Tulsa world predicted approvingly that it would deter future criminals. The Tribune called it community justice. The police chief expressed no meaningful objection. The message was unmistakable. In Tulsa, a mob that decided someone needed to die could act on that decision, and every institution of local government would permit it. For the people of Greenwood, the Belton lynching was a demonstration of how the system actually worked, stripped of all procedural pretense. What had been permitted for a white criminal would be accelerated with far greater enthusiasm for any black man that a white mob decided to target. Tulsa was not merely tense in the spring of 1921. It was a place where violence had been so thoroughly normalized, so consistently endorsed by its own institutions, that it no longer required a significant provocation to ignite. All it required, as it turned out, was a single story in an afternoon newspaper. Memorial Day, May 30th, 1921. Tulsa woke up to warm weather and what appeared, to almost everyone in the city that morning, to be an entirely ordinary day. Dick Rowland was 19 years old. He had grown up in Tulsa, left Booker T. Washington High School before graduating, and found work shining shoes at a parlor on Main Street in the white commercial district of downtown. By every account from those who knew him, he was an easygoing and well-liked young man, known for a warmth with customers that served him well in a job built entirely on personal interaction. His coworkers called him Diamond Dick, a nickname for the diamond-patterned socks he favored, and a personality that caught whatever light was available. A fellow shiner named Robert Fairchild would say decades later that there was simply no version of events in which the Dick Rowland he knew would have done what he was about to be accused of. On the morning of May 30th, Rowland walked to the Drexel building and stepped into the elevator. The elevator was operated by a young white woman named Sarah Page, 21 years old, recently divorced, working a job that thousands of women held in commercial buildings across the country. What happened inside that car during the few seconds it traveled between floors has never been definitively established. What the physical evidence supported, what Page's subsequent behavior corroborated, and what the police department's own investigators eventually concluded is devastatingly mundane. Rowland appears to have tripped as he stepped into the car, grabbed Page's arm instinctively to steady himself, and startled her into crying out. Rowland, acutely aware of what it meant for a white woman to cry out in his presence in Jim Crow, Oklahoma, ran from the building. A white clerk heard the commotion, saw Rowland flee, and called the police. The police took a statement from Sarah Page and found the incident sufficiently unremarkable that they waited until the following morning to arrest Rowland, a delay that tells its own story. If the department had believed a genuine assault had occurred, they would not have waited overnight. Rowland spent the night in his neighborhood, went about his evening, and was taken into custody quietly the next morning and brought to the Tulsa County Courthouse. What changed everything, with the specific and terrible speed that only mass media can produce, was the afternoon edition of the Tulsa Tribune. The Tribune was one of Tulsa's two main daily newspapers, an aggressively competitive afternoon publication built partly on sensationalist crime reporting. When its editors learned of Rowland's arrest, they made a decision that has no defensible journalistic justification and only one coherent explanation. They chose to publish a story designed to provoke a mob. The front page carried a headline that read, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in an elevator." The story described a sexual assault that had not occurred, stated that Rowland had torn Page's clothes, and used his street nickname in a way calculated to make a 19-year-old shoe shiner sound like a known predator. The Tribune's managing editor would later acknowledge that the claims were false. That acknowledgement came after an entire city had already acted on them. Many Tulsa residents recalled a second piece in that edition, an editorial whose headline reportedly read, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." That editorial has never been found. The pages on which it appeared were physically removed from the Tribune's bound archive volumes before they were microfilmed for preservation by someone who understood exactly what they contained. Whether that headline existed precisely as witnesses remembered, it cannot now be proven. What cannot be disputed is what happened in the hours that followed. By 7:30 that evening, a crowd of several hundred white men had assembled outside the Tulsa County Courthouse, demanding that Sheriff Willard McCullough hand Dick Rowland over to them. McCullough refused, moved Rowland to the top floor of the building, secured the elevator, and stationed deputies at the stairwells. Word of the Tribune article and the gathering mob had reached Greenwood within hours. The men of Black Wall Street read that article and heard the talk spreading through the white parts of the city, and they thought of Roy Belton hanging from that telephone pole less than 12 months before. A group of them, perhaps 24, armed and deliberate, drove downtown and offered their services to the sheriff. McCullough sent them home. Some returned a couple of hours later, a larger group, perhaps 50, still armed, still resolved that Dick Rowland was not going to die the way Roy Belton died. The sheriff again sent them away. As that second group of black men turned back toward their vehicles, something happened at the edge of the crowd. A white man reached for the weapon of one of the departing black men. Or a gun was fumbled and discharged. The accounts differ in their details and agree only in their consequence. Shots were fired, and the night that followed was unlike anything that had happened in any American city in living memory. The men from Greenwood retreated north, falling back across the Frisco Railroad tracks that physically divided white Tulsa from black Tulsa. What followed them across those tracks was not a disorganized crowd driven purely by rage, though rage was certainly present. What crossed into Greenwood was something more organized and deliberate, more chilling than spontaneous mob violence alone could account for. The Tulsa Police Department made a decision that placed it permanently on the wrong side of history. Rather than dispersing the crowd and enforcing basic public order, the department began issuing weapons to white civilians who presented themselves at headquarters throughout the night. No names were documented, no roster maintained. An account describes a police official telling the assembled men to go home, get a gun, and get a Negro. Whether those precise words were spoken, the behavior of the men who received city weapons that night was entirely consistent with that instruction. An armed force, operating with the explicit endorsement of Tulsa's police department, moved north toward Greenwood. They crossed the tracks in the pre-dawn darkness armed with hunting rifles and shotguns, moving through the streets of Black Wall Street with a methodical, block-by-block efficiency that eyewitnesses described consistently as resembling a military operation more than a riot. They moved from building to building with purpose. They shot black men encountered in the streets. They forced families out of their homes at gunpoint, marching men, women, and children toward improvised detention areas. They looted comprehensively, taking jewelry, cash, furniture, clothing, anything portable. Multiple survivor testimonies recorded independently across decades converge on a detail too specific to be invention. In the weeks that followed, black residents would encounter white women of their acquaintance wearing the jewelry taken from their homes that morning. And then the buildings were set on fire. Mount Zion Baptist Church, completed just 2 months before the massacre at a cost of $85,000 raised entirely within the black community, burned with a thoroughness that witnesses consistently described as suggesting the fire had been set from above rather than from below. The question of the airplanes is one of the most contested elements of the Tulsa story, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that it cannot be definitively resolved. What can be stated without serious dispute is that multiple aircraft were flying over Greenwood that morning, flying low, confirmed by a large number of credible and independent observers. Among those witnesses was Buck Colbert Franklin, a prominent black lawyer whose office was destroyed that morning and who later wrote a first-hand account discovered in a private collection in 2015 and now preserved at the Smithsonian. Franklin described planes circling overhead, growing in number, humming and dipping low, something that sounded like hail striking the roof of his building, and structure after structure on East Archer Street igniting from its upper floors rather than from below. He described asking himself whether the city of Tulsa was in active conspiracy with the mob destroying it. It was the most rational hypothesis available to any intelligent man watching what was happening. Whatever role the aircraft played, the result is beyond dispute. Greenwood burned. The Dreamland Theater burned. The Stratford Hotel burned. The Tulsa Star burned. The Williams Confectionery burned. The dental offices and law practices that had occupied the upper floors of those carefully constructed commercial buildings burned. The homes burned. The churches burned. The schools burned. The library burned. 35 square blocks of the most prosperous black community in America were reduced to ash and rubble in a single morning. James Durant was 6 years old when his father barricaded the doors and windows of their home with mattresses and told the children to lie flat on the floor. Laverne Cooksey Davis was working as a domestic worker in the white section of Tulsa when she looked northward and saw the sky above Greenwood glowing red. She said that when she finally made it back to the neighborhood and saw nothing but ash and chimney remnants in every direction, she could not stop the tears from coming. Viola Fletcher was 7 years old when the mob moved through her street. Decades later, testifying before the United States House of Representatives as the oldest living survivor of the massacre, she said, "I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. By mid-morning, martial law had been declared and National Guard units were moving into the city. Their arrival did not immediately translate into protection for Greenwood's residents. The Guard participated in the arrest and detention of the district's surviving black population. Men, women, and children were rounded up at gunpoint and marched to holding facilities across the city, including Convention Hall, the Tulsa County Fairgrounds, and a baseball stadium near the center of town. Over the course of that day, more than 6,000 black Tulsans were taken into custody, held behind improvised wire enclosures, required to wear identification tags, and released only if a white Tulsa resident came in person to vouch for them. Some were held for days, some for more than a week, in those makeshift camps, without reliable information about what had happened to their homes or the family members they had been separated from in the chaos of that morning. The official count of those killed was recorded at 36. Historians who have examined every available record, cross-referencing burial documents, hospital admissions, eyewitness accounts, and the locations of mass graves identified by ground-penetrating radar in subsequent decades, now believe the actual death toll was almost certainly in the hundreds, with estimates approaching 300. Many of the dead were buried quickly and without formal documentation, in locations that only modern technology has begun to locate. What happened in the days and years after the fires were extinguished is, in some respects, the hardest part of this story to sit with, because it is the part that transforms a horrific act of racial violence into something even more insidious, a systematic, institutionally supported effort to ensure the violence was never properly accounted for and that the people who suffered it never received anything resembling justice. In the days immediately following the massacre, the official response of the city of Tulsa focused not on the people who had carried out the destruction of Greenwood, but on its victims. Of the 88 indictments a grand jury returned, 74 were filed against black Tulsans, most charged with inciting a riot for arriving armed at the courthouse to prevent a lynching. Not a single white Tulsan was ever charged with murder. Not for the shootings, not for the arsons, not for the destruction of everything that had been built in Greenwood over 15 years. The city had constructed an official version of events requiring its black residents to be the authors of their own destruction, and the legal system enforced that version without apology. The property damage claims filed by Greenwood residents amounted to more than $1.8 million in documented losses. Every single one of those claims, with one exception, was denied. The exception was a white business owner compensated for firearms taken from his shop. The people whose homes had been burned to their foundations, whose businesses had been looted and incinerated, whose life savings had been erased in a single morning, received nothing. What followed was an active, organized suppression of the historical record. The Tulsa Tribune removed its May 31st front-page article from bound archive volumes before they were microfilmed. State militia files disappeared. Police records went missing. The grand jury report effectively absolved the city's white institutions and became for decades the primary official account of what had occurred. Oklahoma's public school history textbooks did not mention the massacre. Tulsa's schools did not teach it. When the local press did occasionally brush against the anniversary, it treated the massacre as a minor civil disturbance rather than what it was. Entire generations grew up in Tulsa, including black Oklahomans who attended schools within walking distance of the streets where the massacre had happened, without any official knowledge of what those streets had once contained or what had been done to them. And yet the community rebuilt. Without financial support from the city, without compensation from the state, and in the face of zoning ordinances specifically designed to prevent reconstruction on their own land, the survivors began clearing rubble within days of the fires going out. 80 businesses had reopened by the end of 1922. The Dreamland Theater came back. The medical practices and law offices returned to Greenwood Avenue. By the early 1940s, Greenwood supported more than 200 black-owned businesses. The people who did that work deserve to be remembered not only as victims of an atrocity, but as practitioners of one of the most sustained acts of defiant human resilience in the modern American record. But the wealth that existed before the massacre was not the wealth that came after. The properties worth millions were gone. The businesses built across 15 years were gone. The networks of credit and mutual economic support that had made the 36-time circulation of a dollar possible had been severed in ways that never fully healed. J.B. Stratford was indicted for inciting a riot and forced to flee Oklahoma permanently. He rebuilt a career in Chicago but never returned to Tulsa. O.W. Gurley relocated to Los Angeles. The compounding wealth that would have passed to their children and grandchildren was extinguished at the source. The silence began to crack in the 1970s when a journalist named Ed Wheeler researched what had happened and found the story too uncomfortable for his publication to print. In 1982, a historian named Scott Ellsworth published the first serious scholarly account of the massacre, confirming through careful documentation what oral tradition had preserved through the long silence. The decisive shift came in the 1990s, driven by the approach of the massacre's 75th anniversary and the efforts of black community leaders in Tulsa, who understood that the last living survivors were aging and their first-hand memories would soon be lost forever. The Oklahoma legislature established a formal commission to document what had happened and assess the question of reparations. Ground-penetrating radar surveys identified subsurface anomalies consistent with mass graves at Oaklawn Cemetery and other sites around Tulsa. The commission's final report, delivered in 2001, confirmed the complicity of the Tulsa Police Department, documented the cover-up, and recommended that direct financial reparations be paid to survivors and to the descendants of those who had lost property and loved ones. The Oklahoma State Legislature declined to implement that recommendation. A federal court ruled in 2004 that too much time had elapsed for the legal claims of survivors to proceed, a determination that, in itself, says something profound about how the law weighs the passage of time against the persistence of injustice. 121 surviving victims had been formally identified. Not one of them received a cent. Viola Fletcher was 7 years old when she watched the mob move through her street. She lived to the age of 111, spending decades bearing witness to what she had seen and what it had cost. In the spring of 2021, 100 years after the massacre, she sat before a committee of the United States House of Representatives and spoke with the full weight of a century behind every word. She said that the neighborhood she had fallen asleep in on the night of May 30th was rich, not only in money and property, but in culture, in community, and in the sense of dignity that comes from living in a place built by your own people. She said she had lived through the massacre every single day. She said her country might forget this history, but that she could not. She died in November of 2025 at 111, having never received the reparations the commission had recommended more than 2 decades before her death. The story of the Tulsa Race Massacre is ultimately a story about what becomes possible when human beings commit fully to building something together, and about what happens when other human beings organized by fear and white supremacist ideology and the cruelty of institutions that have decided whose lives matter are permitted to destroy it. It is a story about how easily the record of atrocity can be buried when the institutions responsible for maintaining that record are the same institutions responsible for committing the atrocity. And it is a story about what is owed not only in the legal and financial sense that the Oklahoma Commission tried and failed to address, but in the deeper sense of historical honesty. That honesty requires acknowledging that the wealth, the opportunity, and the generational security extinguished on Greenwood Avenue in the early hours of June 1, 1921, did not simply disappear into history.